mental health lecture. I'm sponsored by the Vincent Wood Memorial Foundation and co-hosted by the With Chinese Palo Alto Chinese Parent Club. My name is Wendy, one of the board members for With Chinese, along with Anne here. Before we begin, some backgrounds on the hosting organizations. So With Chinese is an organization serving Chinese families who live in Palo Alto and nearby communities since 2014. Our mission is to build a community around Chinese Americans and partnering with local nonprofits. You might have come to our Lunar New Year Fair event, which this year took place in February at Mitchell Park Community Center. The Palo Alto Chinese Parents Club is part of the With Chinese organization. The goal is to organize Chinese parents of Palo Alto, promote good parenting, school involvement, and community integration. We offer both social and educational events, and this mental health series is one of them. If you are interested in more information, please come and visit our website. Today's presentation will be approximately 45 minutes with roughly 15 minutes of Q&A. Please save your question toward the end. The question can be entered in the chat box. You can either write your question in Chinese or English. So now, without further ado, I would like to present Dr. Stephen Sust, a child and adolescent psychiatrist at Stanford University. Welcome, Dr. Sust.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Wendy. Let me get my technological ducks in a row here. Let me start my slideshow. Well, let me first off thank everybody at With Chinese and the Vincent Wu Foundation for making this happen. You're here likely because you got this flyer, which has a very nice QR code and information for registration, especially with a small group meeting that we're going to have in about 2 weeks. And it'll be for people who are interested in coming to talk in a small group sort of setting. And it'll be limited to the first come, first serve of the first 10 people. And because it'll be in Palo Alto, it'll prioritize the Palo Alto registrants. So I just wanted to put this QR code back in front of people. And again, encourage people who haven't registered more officially to do so that way, so that they might be able to get into the queue for the small group. So with that being said, we're going to be talking about a tougher topic, bullying, and what I'm going to try to instead focus on as much as I can, focus on the interventions for bullying that I think are probably the most promising and the most effective things for us to consider working on together. Below, you just can see the logos of all the different primary care clinics and practices that I'm associated with. I'm not going to go into all of it, but essentially, what you'll learn about me over the course of the short time together is that I'm kind of all over the place in terms of what I do. So first, in terms of the land acknowledgement, as you know, at Stanford, we have taken a very strong stance on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we want to respect the ancestral lands that Stanford sits on for the Muwekma and Ohlone tribe. It's very important to us that we honor and be very transparent about the university's relationship with California's Native peoples. So a little bit about me. I'm not going to go into all of this again, just because we can talk about that at like the small group setting, but I've had what is called a non-traditional approach to my career. And I am the middle child of 3 boys whose parents are from Hong Kong and have had a very colorful pathway into my current areas of interest, which include blurring the lines of the traditional psychiatry practice with primary care and schools and socio-emotional learning. As a child of immigrant parents, I always wanted to make sure that for the people who supported us and helped me to get to where I am now, that I'm going to pay it forward back to the people that paid us and help support us. So I work often with many underserved communities. Personal disclosures, cisgendered male. If we have some time later on in the small group, my dad has some Cuban influence in him, and again, we're originally from Hong Kong. I have sought my own mental health treatment, and frankly, for anybody who's gone through medical training, it is incredibly difficult, and I don't think I'd be the same without having gone through the getting my own mental health treatment during that time period. A lot of things happening at the same time, and I just want everybody to know there are a lot of things that I'm not good at still, and I'm still working on, and I just want you to know that if there's anything that I'm saying that are not clear, or maybe even uh, making you feel uncomfortable, please feel free to let me know, and I will try to address as quickly as I can here. So starting things off, when I first was asked to give this talk, this article came out in early January 2024. It was an interesting article because it basically talks about what we probably already understand, that bullying obviously weakens the trust that our young people have, and that can then cascade into larger mental health problems. And I think, again, there's a lot of converging lines of evidence around this. And in this study, where they looked at England's Millennium Cohort Study, which is a registry of about 10,000 youth over time, they found that there was just 3.5 times more likely to be significant mental health problems as a result of childhood bullying. And so, again, the evidence is pretty robust, and frankly, from a outsider standpoint, it is actually not too surprising at the same time. So, with that being said, this started at the beginning of me trying to have a more structured framework around how we talk about bullying. And the CDC, the United States has the CDC, which not only is a public health authority, but it also created this very nice framework by which, frankly, internationally, everybody sort of agrees on the ways to study and categorize bullying. But I just want to bring this up just to make sure we're all on the same page here. So bullying is defined as unwanted aggressive behaviors by another youth or group of youths who aren't siblings or current dating partners that involves an observed sort of perceived power imbalance, and is repeated multiple times and highly likely to be repeated. Bullying can cause distress, including physical, psychological, social, and educational harms. One second, I just wanted to turn on my laser pointer so that I remember where the pointer is here. For the modes of bullying, it's direct and indirect. Direct, as you can imagine, is just, as an example, could be face-to-face and or verbal. Indirect is aggressive behaviors that aren't directly communicated and can be anything like false rumors or making up stories about people. And again, this is just some of the simple ways to categorize the modes. Now, the types of bullying can range from physical to verbal. I'm not going to read every single one of these. Quite frankly, in a lot of ways, it is pretty self-explanatory. I think the relational one is particularly important, where a young person will try to or a bully will try to interrupt a young person's social network, and will, in my day, it was writing something in the bathroom on the walls, and just doing things that are intentionally very embarrassing and meant to degrade and demean the other person. And then damage to property, taking something that isn't yours, again, very self-explanatory. And then the context or location. This is important too, because the bullying is, usually seen by the young people. And what's also problematic about the bullying is that the response to the bullying by the community at large can encourage or discourage bullying behaviors. So the actions that we take, the young people see it. And we have a very prominent role, I think, as the adults in our community to help support our young people and to help reshape how we all live together and get along together here. So context and location of the bullying is also equally important as well. So this all sets up for what I'm going to look at in terms of the basics for the CDC data regarding bullying as it's out there. And the bullying is, again, data is captured in the CDC data sets. And you'll notice every single one of my slides has some sort of a screenshot. And on the lower left or the lower right, there's usually a link to the material that I've cited. And again, none of this material is anything that I've created on my own. It's very much just taken from the research of other very, very wonderful people who have already taken this data and gathered it together for us to take a look at today. So I wanted to draw your attention to this chart that was in that book that I'd taken a screenshot of in the last slide. And this is national trends in the United States. On the x-axis at the top here, you'll notice that these are the years starting from 2011 to 2021. And on the y-axis here, here were some of the statements that were, or the questions that were asked of the young people who responded to the survey. And you can sort of see they run the range from experiencing sexual violence to just being threatened or being electronically bullied. This is a nice little update that I hadn't realized that they were also capturing at the CDC. But you can sort of see what this whole chart is trying to depict, which is this trend column on the far right. And they've nicely labeled it with green as going in the right direction, where bullying has been decreasing as a trend over time in the most recent year's data. And for yellow, there's been no change, which is also unfortunate too, but that is not quite as bad as this red sign, which is things are going in the wrong direction. So there's a number of concerns about bullying and a lot of school violence that has either gone mostly unchanged or maybe even getting worse. And so this is important data for us to pay attention to because this is something that the CDC collects on a regular basis and is something that will continue to be a trend that we monitor at large as a nation here. And I went to go look for the data in China. And so this was one of the studies that jumped out at me. And you'll remember that in the previous slide, there was about 1 in 5, like a 20% prevalence of bullying that was happening in some of the numbers that I had mentioned. Although from what I remember in this previous slide, bullied at school was going down 15% in 2021. Simultaneously over here, they said 20% in China, estimated prevalence of victimization. And well, it's just say that things are pretty comparable regardless of geographically where you're at. And when we're talking about different parts of the United States nation as well as the Chinese nation as well. And again, this is just one study, and well, it's one study of many studies, but still the data is already out there and people are actively tracking this information. And it's to highlight how humanistic this problem might be, and that it's not anything about race or ethnicity alone. It's very much about us as people and how do we get along with each other. So this was a really great study. I encourage everybody to take a closer look at this later on if you'd like. The reason why I bring it up is because I was starting to think through some of the distinguishing characteristics of bullying and especially victimization. And the CDC, this group of authors, took a closer look at the data yet again, and they found that for young people who are trying to find themselves and their sexual identity, that they were actually increased risk relative to the general population, that they're increased risk of being victimized by bullying. And that's a trend that we've noticed again, because we've been highlighting how there are other worries about the LGBTQ community, especially as it relates to my field, child psychiatry, and their risk of suicide attempts. So this all very much aligns together with bullying and our understanding of the link between bullying and mental health problems. And I wanted to highlight this again here because this is one of those special populations that we should be paying attention to, especially as we think about bullying. So in moving along to the next stage of things, some of the risk factors for childhood bullying. Now, I want to highlight that this is risk factors, right? This isn't that just because you have poor family functioning, you're destined to have bullying. It's not that. It's not that they're causal. It's just that there tends to be some sort of correlative sort of relationship that we're not sure exactly what's going on here, that puts people at risk of childhood bullying. So family cohesion and ability to resolve conflicts, the increasing level of attention to the social determinants of health and socioeconomic status. These are just some of the social factors that can obviously affect your risk of childhood bullying. And the same thing with adverse childhood experiences. A lot of the chaos and that happens in the presence of any physical abuse, and even psychological, emotional, verbal abuse can be problematic as well. For physical factors, people who have chronic medical problems, that have any sort of difference in their appearance, for example, burn scars, craniofacial abnormalities, etc. These are all things that are risk factors in your terms of your physical health history that could affect your risk of experiencing childhood bullying. And again, I mentioned the LGBTQ plus, and for the behavioral, people who have learning disabilities are also at risk of experiencing childhood bullying. So I wanted to return back to this previous slide, context or location, because again, to me, our response to bullying, our response to bullying by adults and youth can encourage or discourage bullying behaviors. And I think it's important for us to think together as a community around how do we prevent these types of things from happening, or at least how do we intervene in a sensitive fashion so that we might be able to find I guess a mutually agreed upon sort of compromise or at least a tangible solution to the problem at hand here. And I wanted to circle back to this 2013 slide or 2014 study that looked at 2013 CDC data. That was the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that we were talking about before, where there was that red chart with the red, yellow, and green indicator. So this study that looked at the data from back then was comparing cyberbullying versus on-site school bullying. And they were trying to make a comparison between the two. And I don't think there was anything that was too surprising in this data. Being bullied on school or in cyberspace was significantly positively associated with psychiatric problems, substance use, being overweight, this playing video games for 3 or more hours per day. Not quite sure how that came about, but it was something that jumped out at me as well. And then there's also having asthma. And again, the greatest association was with having mental health problems when experiencing bullying on school campus or in virtual space. Cyberbullying was particularly problematic and again, associated with developing mental health problems later on. So the thing I wanted to highlight about this study was that they identified some protective behaviors against bullying victimization, which was eating breakfast every day and being physically active and playing on sports teams. And I'll touch upon all of this together a little bit later, but it's interesting that what I think a lot of these factors tie into is this idea of how we take care of ourselves as individuals and taking care of our bodies and just making sure that we're in good physical sort of shape and paying attention to our basic physiologic needs here. And then playing on sports teams is also an interesting aspect. And I think this might be an artifact of the studies only really asking about sports teams. And I don't know if they had the chance to ask about other more organized activities like math team or journalism club and like those types of things. So we'll touch upon that again a little bit later on, but I just wanted to highlight how they cite this attention to your physiologic needs and being socially engaged with others, especially in a constructive fashion, as a protective factor. So, as mentioned before, these were the risk factors that were covered before, and I wanted to again sort of highlight these protective factors here. High self-esteem. Self-esteem is important, but there's a sweet spot, right? You don't want them to have too little self-esteem because then there's the shame and sort of embarrassment, maybe even guilt. And on the other side, when you have too much self-esteem, there's arrogance and overconfidence. You want to find just the right amount. And it's probably a tall order to ask a young person to develop such a high, such a lofty goal at such a young age. And I think it's important for everybody to recognize that this is a moving target and it will change over time as we get older. But it's important to at least highlight that this is a developing concept and especially it's unique for each person. So I just wanted to highlight that this is what's called a protective factor against bullying, having a strong sense of self, a strong sense of your own boundaries, and having a good relationship with people and being able to have some social skills that allow you to tap into people. If not, and then it's not about how many people you know, right? But sometimes it's about the depth and the intimacy of your relationships with people. And touching upon that, having good communication with your parents, having trusted adults in your life, positive peer role models, and having what's called a growth mindset, an orientation towards learning in the school environment. I think between family and school, there's an alignment between what we're trying to support our young people into this growth mindset of trying to not only learn more academically, but to grow socio-emotionally. And what I think really kind of brings everything together is when you organize young people together into either sports, music and orchestra, um, like club activities at school, I think there's a lot to be said about the teamwork and not allowing young people to fall into the trap of success being only an individual metric and that there's just something that I alone have to do, as opposed to what are we capable of doing together as a larger team and group. And especially when we're able to communicate, coordinate, and plan accordingly, because we're able to then do something more together than any one of us could do alone. So I think that's something that's really important that I wanted to double down on in terms of the protective factors, because this also then decreases social isolation and increases the likelihood of being able to find the right people who are able to support you. So really, really important to sort of talk through all these different levels, as you can see with the individual, family, social, school, and neighborhood, and to highlight all of these opportunities for all of us to intervene on our young people's lives here. So I'm trying to keep track of the time as I'm going through the slides here. This is another slide that talks about the the United Kingdom's Millennium Cohort study. Again, looking through the almost 20,000 kids in the cohort, and they found that in their studies where they were looking at appearance and self-esteem and whether or not there was a relationship with dieting or bullying, what they found was that the self-esteem and your overall sort of comfort with your own appearance was actually most important, and the association of developing socio-emotional problems and sort of externalizing symptoms later on in teenage years. And that with this important sort of piece of information, it raises again the question of how are we growing, how are we working with our young people around growing to understand their bodies and um, not putting themselves into an area where they're developing a sort of toxic, sort of maybe negative sort of attitude towards their bodies, which again does happen based off of the way that some young people can have some ideas miscommunicated to them around how they should be feeling about their bodies. And this was a really great study to highlight some questions for us to again think about how do we talk again with our young people around their bodies and their self-esteem and how important it is to really think through whether or not our young people are growing up with maybe too negative a slant on how they on their attitude about themselves and how they feel. And I bring this up. This slide is something that I use in my eating disorders talks, but um, I think we've all pretty much understood the whole body negativity concept. And then on the flip side, there's the body positivity concept. And I think one of the things that's been more interesting for me is this idea of body neutrality, that you shouldn't necessarily always have to be in either a body positive or body negative sort of mindset, but that you instead sort of focus on the acceptance of your body and focus very much more on what it does and why you love what it does for you, and to accept that loving your body or accepting your body as it is a process and it's going to take time. And again, this is a larger discussion, and I know this picture depicts the female body because the male body is also part of this too. But again, this is part of a larger discussion, and it's already 3:01, so I got to keep moving here. So we'll come back to that another time, I'm guessing. So I wanted to focus the shift on now to the current directions that we're trying to make with what's called restorative practices. But I want to also highlight that restorative practices, or especially around here, have had a somewhat rocky implementation. And as you can expect, there's not always been the multi-level sort of integration of restorative practices that's needed to successfully execute the restorative practice models that are out there. And I've attached some screenshots of some really colorful discussions around restorative practices. And here they wanted to pick on restorative justice as it's been implemented in the schools. And it's obviously had some mixed outcomes. And again, the you can dive into Reddit if you wanted to go see that a little bit more. But it's an interesting point that it is controversial. And it's mostly controversial, I think, because we have not had the chance to implement it with fidelity. And it requires a lot of multi-level buy-in and support to sort of integrate and make it work well. So the restorative practices, again, in very short sort of terms, tries to bring every level of the community together here, from the individual student level to the classroom teacher level to the parents in the school level, and just really trying to bring the neighborhood together and to realign relationships and communication and to address conflict and miscommunication in a more positive and restorative fashion. And to also, most importantly, when resolving the conflict, that people and groups acknowledge the responsibility. I think this is particularly important too. So with that in mind, I think this infographic very nicely ties together all of the different aspirations of restorative practices in a nutshell. But honestly, there are textbooks and workshops that you have to do to be an expert in restorative practices. And while I'm an expert in psychiatry, I am not an expert in restorative practices, and I'll have to defer others to really work with their local school districts, or maybe we can talk afterwards around how you would want to get better trained in restorative practices that tie the community together. And decrease the amount of fragmentation that's happening amongst our young people. So again, restorative practices are important, and it actually overlaps with what's called socio-emotional learning at the school. Here in Palo Alto, they're deeply ensconced in socio-emotional learning and restorative practices. And this infographic in the circles surrounding the square, it highlights the different ways that socio-emotional learning and restorative practices overlap on each other. And as mentioned before, it is very much about relationships. It's very much about communication and empowering individuals and trying to figure out ways for all of us to understand how our uh, our focused attention on working together and trying to reconcile our differences and find commonalities, that it's all part of us growing up together in society and trying to figure out how to, again, not let our differences overshadow the strengths of what we can do together when we're able to collaborate. So this was a nice infographic that highlights what I hope that you all will get the chance to look at a little bit later in the slides. The 4Ps. So this is also another component of restorative practices where at the different parts, at the different Ps, you get to reflect on how restorative practices can shift the relationship, where individuals and how they interact with not only each other, but with the larger community and the types of impact that that person has on their community. And then in terms of place, it's thinking about where they are and the different rules or maybe the different variables that are affecting the climate of the school and I guess the way that people are responding to each other and behaving with each other. Practice, opportunities for the teachers to intervene in a sensitive fashion and create chances for some reconciliation of the differences and to come up with mutually agreed upon reconciliation of those differences. And the plan part, this is obviously a larger thing whereby school communities have to make these restorative practices a regular process within the school. And again, this focuses a lot on the school, and this is purposeful because the infographic that I pulled this from is focused on the school. But I want to highlight again that the school is not the only place where restorative practices should be focused on. It is very much going to be important that families or communities are also thinking about how do we implement restorative practices at home, and how do we use these tools early on so that young people are getting consistent messages early on in life and understanding the importance of being equitable and fair, and to use these restorative practices to, again, be able to live harmoniously with one another and collaborate together as much as we can. So these spheres of influence from the classroom and the individuals in the classroom to the next level of the community and the campus, there are these spheres that restorative practices can be utilized all across the neighborhoods and all across the systems, and highlighting how important it is for us to think about not just what happens at the schools, but also think about what happens in our families and what happens in our other systems, for example, like the justice system. And I think touching upon the previous Reddit post around how young people are often often not necessarily in a place where they think about how they come together as a group and where their goals like align together. I want to believe that everybody is here because we want to move towards supporting our young people towards self-actualization. This is a Chinese slide that I've used before in one of my talks, of a Western psychological concept from a psychologist named Abraham Maslow. If you've ever taken a Psychology 101 class, you've likely heard about this already, but basically self-actualization is that inner superstar, superhero, rock star, whatever dream concept we have of ourselves. And in order to get to that top part of self-actualization at the top of the pyramid, you need all the bottom levels of the pyramid in order to make it to that point. And I won't go through all of Maslow's hierarchy. It's my opinion. Again, it's fairly self-explanatory. But again, I want to highlight how important it is that everybody, again, recognize that we're all here because we want all of our young people to get a chance to try to tap into that self-actualization, and that school and their relationships with each other, it's all coming together as a way for them to get up towards that self-actualization piece. And that common goal that everybody shares is something that I think should tie us together into better understanding why these restorative practices are so important. And that, again, sometimes in the midst of the grind, we sometimes lose sight of the fact that we're all very much in it together. We're stronger together, and we should very much be supporting each other in that sort of way here. So with that in mind, these are like discussion circles that are used in restorative practices. One of the ones I wanted to highlight were the reintegration circles or the peace circles. Whenever there are conflicts amongst people, there's a chance to sort of talk through it in a mediated and supportive fashion. And that when you're going through these talks in these circles, there's a chance for better understanding, and to rebuild the relationships is probably the most important part. The reintegration circle is particularly important, in my opinion, because it helps to restart the process of healing and rebuilding of any relationships whenever someone's been wronged. And this kind of leads me into where I was going with trying to find instances of restorative practices that were already being conducted back in Hong Kong and China. And I found this set of slides, which was really interesting, from Dr. Dennis Wong and his center over in Hong Kong. And in looking through, I tried to find other literature, and it brought me to this book and his book chapter, which is really a great read. And I absolutely recommend people take a look at this and borrow it from the library if you can find a copy. I happen to borrow Stanford's copy, and I actually can see it right here. So hopefully nobody tries to steal it from me. But I wanted to talk about this book because it has a case that I thought would be a great illustration of restorative practices in action, rather than, again, drawing out these diagrams. So this textbook case that they had was labeled the Booger Boy case. And it's about two boys, Frankie and Bobby. They're friends in school, and while they were playing, Frankie says to everybody, "Stay away from Bobby." And Bobby was really sensitive and upset by Frankie's words on the playground. So Bobby reactively walked over and pushed Frankie. And as Frankie was falling backwards, he grabbed Bobby, who was a little bit more well-nourished, and Bobby fell on top of Frankie, and Frankie broke his arm. And it was a fairly significant fracture in his arm, and it required surgery and an arm cast, which again was pretty unremarkably fixed in the hospital. So the nice part about it is that the social worker was able to come and bring the Frankie and Bobby together, and they were able to talk through and reconcile and work through apologies. But the school social worker still had an unresolved issue, which was that Frankie's mother had asked for financial compensation for the hospital bills, which is an interesting point to sort of think about, because this is not usually something that in traditional schools that we think about. And being able to use this as part of the restorative practice or the restorative justice part of this case is an additional element that I really liked and I wanted to highlight for this talk here. So for the boys at the individual level, there was a mediation conference. Everybody got together. And off to the right, this is the traditional peacemaking circle. a lot of restorative practices are inspired, adapted, dare I say, from Native Americans' restorative practices, where you can see the seating position, that the offender and the victim are seated in a circle across from each other, and that there's a circle of elders and families of the offender and the victim and the community members that all get together and they talk through it. In this case, for Frankie and Bobby, we come to find out during their mediation process that Frankie told his friends not to get close to Bobby because he saw Bobby pick his nose without cleaning his hands. Frankie had absolutely no intention of isolating Bobby from the friend group. Um, but Frankie didn't understand at the time that Bobby, being a heavier child, was very, very worried about not having any friends to play with. So Frankie's words about not playing with Bobby was obviously very triggering. And so that contributed to Bobby's emotional reaction. So this is very nice highlighting the understanding process that happens with the individual mediation of things. At the family level, um, so separately, the social worker was skilled to know that they should separate the kids from the parents, and that the parents alone should meet separately to discuss this $10,000 compensation for Frankie's medical bills. So Bobby's mother was at home and mostly taking care of the in-laws, and so they basically couldn't afford to pay $10,000, and they had to open up the conversation again to really understand what's going on here. So Frankie's mother wasn't really able to even accept any lesser amount of money because there was a tremendous amount of social pressure from her husband and her mother-in-law. They felt that Bobby didn't really regret his actions and that he had hurt their only male child in the whole family. But on Bobby's side of things, Bobby's dad is the only breadwinner, and he had to, I guess his mom also had to take care of their 7 family members at home that included Bobby's older grandparents. So Bobby's mother was very sad about this whole incident and felt really, really guilty that they couldn't repay Frankie's family a little bit more here. So it was nice that they were able to sort of talk to each other and understand the backgrounds, the social backgrounds that they were all coming from here. And they were able to sort of use that as a way to at least start to understand each other. I think what really made this case work out well, as it's published in the text again, is that the mediator, social worker, conducted independent check-ins with Bobby and Frankie's moms, both before and after the meeting where the terms were discussed in their agreement. And then furthermore, the social worker mediator allowed the moms time to confer with their respective family members, who are also very important decision makers in their families. And I think the final thing that I think was also really helpful is that there was the holistic perspective where Frankie was obviously the victim, broke his arm. There's no question that there was very much a lot of harm that he experienced, but that there was also some of his own contributing role to this unfortunate accident when he yelled out on the playground, don't play with Bobby. And so Frankie ultimately had written a card to his own grandma and, basically saying that he also had some role in this as well. And this card that was written to his grandmother helped to soften some of her concerns around getting just compensation for what happened here. Now, this is also notable in my opinion because I grew up in a traditional Chinese family as well. And since my dad owned a restaurant, we had a lot of different types of Chinese food. And I never really appreciated how expensive the fish maw was. But this obviously is going to come as no surprise to the Chinese families that are here and are obviously going to recognize, like my mother, how obviously expensive fish maw can be, and that this was part of the reason why Frankie's grandmother was looking for so much money, that there is a traditional cultural practice to support post-operative recovery by giving the recovering person fish maw soup. And well, it was a fun twist in the case because this is again something that if you didn't really know beforehand, you would have you could have potentially overlooked it like myself, and you would have not had the chance to really understand why this was so important to the different decision makers in this case. It also turned out that Frankie's grandmother was offended that Bobby didn't bring a basket of fruit to the hospital and offer more support. And there was obviously, again, the concern that there was some disrespect of Frankie as the sole male child in the family. Um, and again, there's Bobby's home, which consisted of multiple family members that required a lot of attention from Bobby's mother, and her ability to even go to a hospital um, was probably compromised by some of those responsibilities here. So all of this really came together as items to discover over the course of this case, and again helps to illustrate why restorative practices are so important and that they're delivered in a skillful fashion here. At the end of, oh, by the way, at the end of that case, it turns out that, again, they were able to settle upon a lesser non-monetary agreement that everybody seemed to do well with and accept, and help to eliminate some of the disagreements that were happening in the final agreement that they were able to draw up here. But it was a great case, and that was just one. There's actually another case that's really good too, but I'll leave that for another time. I wanted to bring up this infographic because the last case, and frankly, all of this talk around bullying really circles around how do we communicate effectively here, and really being able to use socio-emotional learning and being able to teach not only our young people, but also ourselves too, if you think about it. How often do we actually go through this little algorithm that's depicted on this picture and think about how are we delivering our communication here, and are we doing it with all of these things already lined up in mind? And I guess I'll not spend too much time on the individual components of this, as this is something that you can review on the slides a little bit later on. But I think it serves to really help think through how we communicate, and especially with the intention part, and then the compassion and the empathy. Can we mentalize and put ourselves in the other person's shoes and understand their perspective and feelings here? That is not something that I think we get the chance to really explore with our young people as often. And I hope that that's something that you do get the chance to, again, sit down with your young person and think through, and really be in a place of how to communicate effectively with your young person. And then for all of us as adults, I think practicing the empathic listening, well, actually, so full disclosure, as a psychiatrist, this is something that's hammered into us fairly early on, but it's to say that this is also something really important, I think, in general, that these are what are called empathy blockers, and that there's a number of things that we say or sometimes do that embody this blocking of empathy, and can actually create barriers in communication with our young person. And I, in particular, as a physician, we find ourselves in this advising place where we sometimes don't get the chance to really practice that empathic listening, and that we actually move into problem solving mode maybe a little too quickly. And that is something that we definitely didn't talk about as much in med school, but I'm hoping that's something that we do get to fix a little bit more, because it is an important part of building the doctor-patient relationship and getting to a therapeutic place where we can talk through any problems that might be happening here. So again, these are all empathy blockers that are great to think about and to reflect upon maybe some of the things that we're saying or doing that are not as sensitive, and maybe creating communication barriers with our young people. So as we're coming towards the end of things, I wanted to highlight that there are multiple studies that have looked at not only the young people, but then also older adults, whereby adults who are victims of childhood bullying, again, grew up to be associated with more mental health problems, and that there was, again, this longer lasting sort of impact on the person's life. And this is not something that we should continue uh, as it has been, that we're very much in a place where the society is looking to shift and to try to improve our interventions on our young people's experiences of bullying. And I think we have to do it because the that suicide and homicide have not changed as the most some of the most lethal causes of death in our young people here in the United States. And the hope is that as we get better at improving communication, implementing restorative practices, and trying to help our young people again communicate with one another so that they can coexist together and see the strengths of what they're capable of collectively. And again, this has very much been a thing for a really long time now, but I'm hoping again that our renewed attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion is going to change some of these very unfortunate leading causes of death in our young people. So this is again trying to highlight how there's a journey into adulthood with bullying. And it's important to try and highlight it, obviously, as a young person. But I wanted to leave this article for you guys to take a look at because it highlighted how bullying can manifest itself. Direct and indirect bullying can manifest itself in the workplace as well. And this was a really great Harvard Business Review article that highlights some of that, which I encourage a lot of you adults to read and potentially even talk about with your 18 to 21-year-old college age kids or any of your young adults who are in the workforce. Great talk. Great sort of, it's a great article to sort of kick off the talk that I think we should all be having with our families. And then finally, I just wanted to close with the importance of early help seeking and how important it is to build trust with our young people, that their social isolation, their belief that everything always hangs on me alone, that I have to superhero this myself and to just charge through it myself. That is, I'm going to argue that's not the only way to go about it. I think there's a role for early help seeking and trying to get help from people early on. And I really like this picture because this young person drew a picture for a Google contest and was chosen and got a prize. And you know, her picture was a very poignant sort of moment to recognize how important we all are to each other and how sometimes when we're caught up in the grind, we don't get to really appreciate and acknowledge that. So I wanted to highlight this really beautiful Google picture, and I use it as a reminder to all of us that we're stronger together. And we really need to help our young people build those communications and relationships with one another so that we can find each other and again, be a little bit more efficient and just have a better experience of growing up together. So I just want to say thanks again for listening. You can see here, this is the QR code for today's slides. If you want to grab your phone, you can snag a copy of it so that you don't have to wait for the slides to be sent out to you. You can feel free to share it. Again, nothing in there is any of my own original content. It's either directly copied from or adapted from other people's work. And it's directly linked in every single one of the slides. But if you have any other questions, you can feel free to ask. This is my team at Stanford that is nice enough to, again, include me in all of their activities. And together we do a lot of things in the community. But if you had any further questions about us, the information is on the left-hand column here. Let's see. I think that's about it. And it's 3:28. I think I went way over the 40